Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, so they also asked me to talk about stewardship, which is a very, very broad topic. So I have a lot of room in which to operate. So I've picked two aspects for the topic of stewardship in Islamic civilization. The first aspect of stewardship is that I'll be addressing its challenge. I'm going to be talking about the challenges of stewardship. The second aspect is that I'll be speaking from the perspective of Muslim scholars and Muslim scholarly tradition. So my guess is most people in the room are Muslims. So this is pretty much normal for us. So anyway, the overall question I want to address is a compound one. The challenges of shepherding a community through the sea of culture, a sea that is at once enriching and destructive, impossible to resist and resistible depending on how hard one is willing to try. And finally, about the choice of when and how hard to try. I'm going to read that again. The challenge of shepherding a community through the sea of culture, a sea that is at once enriching and destructive, impossible to resist and resistible, depending on how hard one is willing to try, and finally about the choice of when and how hard to try. First, I want to offer a short summary to try and very quickly make my point. I have quotation marks here. Make my point. Stewardship is a challenge for two main reasons. First, because the ulama are instructed to respect custom as long as it does not violate the Sharia. The ulama have been instructed to respect custom and culture as long as it does not violate the Sharia. But the ambiguities inherent in the derivation of Islamic law from its scriptural sources, as well as cultural prejudice, have sometimes made it hard to know when something is violating the Sharia or not. So the ambiguities inherent in the derivation of Islamic law from its scriptural sources, as well as the cultural prejudice, have sometimes made it hard to know when something is violating the Sharia. And particularly, here I'll be talking about the questions of caste and race in Islamic marriage norms. Caste and race in Islamic marriage norms. Second, because the ulama need to respect custom, this is the second challenge. The ulama need to, it's not that they've been commanded to respect custom, they need to respect custom. They need to respect custom for a couple of reasons. The first is a reason of principle, namely that the Quran and the Sunnah command this. The Quran and the Sunnah have commanded the ulama to respect custom. And also for two reasons of practicality. So the first is a reason of principle, the second two are reasons of practicality. The ulama don't want to drive people away. They don't want to drive people away from Islam. And two, because pre-modern normative institutions did not have the capacity to turn the aircraft carrier of culture. Cultures like an aircraft carrier, pre-modern institutions just do not have the capacity to change it in any really meaningful way. It's very hard, it takes a long time. I also want to make sure to state before I go on, obviously, though culture is an aircraft carrier, Islam and Muslims are not simply paddle boarders run over by it. And I read an article that said paddle boarding is popular in the UK now. Is that true? I don't even know what it is. But so Islam and Muslims are not simply paddle boarders that get run over by the aircraft carrier of culture. They can and have directed culture in meaningful ways and in world historically significant ways. Islam has been a force that has affected enormous cultural change. Just a few quick examples. There's lots of examples, but a few quick ones. Of course, with the spread of the Muslim state and gradual conversion to Islam, we can see the consumption of alcohol drop dramatically. This is actually about 15 years old. This data is about 15 years old from the World Health Organization, but this is more recent data which shows the same thing, but I like this map better. You can see here the areas in which less than 2.5 liters of alcohol per person are drunk. There's a pointer. Here, basically the Muslim majority populations. Balkans not doing too well, Soviet Central Asia. By the way, that shows the power of modern states. Modern states can change culture. Look at post-Soviet Central Asia. I've never encountered alcohol ingestion like I encountered in Kyrgyzstan in 1997 when I went there. No, 1995. I was a teenager, and as a teenager, American teenage American, of course, my main interest was the acquisition and consumption of alcohol. So I was very interested in that, and I observed this. You can see, so look at the, and by the way, this is what I call the booze belt. Booze belt, there's Wales. The very tip of the dragon's nose or whatever, the booze belt. Okay. And even after, even with populations that had notionally converted to Islam already, there could still be dramatic cultural change as reform movements have striven to inculcate religious observation and religious observance more deeply in the culture. This could be done by stick as opposed to carrot. For example, the Padri Wars in Sumatra in the early 1800s, in which very eager religious students sought to convince local notionally Muslim populations to pray more regularly, and also combated widespread popular vices like gambling, cockfighting. I saw a cockpit today at that place. Where was that? St. Fagans. Yeah, there's apparently they built buildings for cockfighting. So they sought to prevent widespread and popular vices like gambling, cockfighting, and selling fellow Muslims into slavery. The reasons I picked this as an example is I wanted something where all the audience was going to be able to cheer for the deeper inculcation of religious norms, and I'm making you cheer for it by saying that they're stopping people from selling other Muslims into slavery. It could also be done by hook or carrot, by non-compulsory means. For example, the Sowarian tradition of Islamic teaching and proselytizing in West Africa, named after the 16th century scholar Hajj Salim Sowari, worked on grassroots education and on persuasion, avoiding political entanglements and seeing education and piety as the primary means to building a Muslim community. Another actually very good example is the Tablighi Jamaat movement, which is probably very well represented in the UK. Founded in 1927 to educate Muslims. By here I mean notionally Muslims, people who are notionally Muslims, but who didn't, for example, know the Shahada. They didn't know how to say there's no God but God, Muhammad is a messenger of God. They didn't know how to pray. They didn't know anything about their religion. To educate Muslims in North India on the basics of Islamic belief and practice. And it's now one of the biggest and most influential Muslim movements in the world. But let's focus on less world historical and civilizational trends and look at Muslim scholars as stewards of the Sharia at a smaller scale, at real instances of challenge and controversy. I want to open with a few illustrative vignettes because, first, they're illustrative, and second, they're vignettes, which means that they're, I think, entertaining. The first one, Tuanku Imam Bonjol, who was one of the main figures in the Padri Wars, after his movement started to help educate, quote unquote, educate the local Muslim population by force a lot of the time in northern Sumatra, he then turned against the Dutch. So he's also kind of an anti-Dutch, kind of anti-colonial figure. Iban Batuta, you guys all know about Iban Batuta, right? The most famous traveler in all history. Died, I think, in the 1360s or 1370s. We don't know exactly when he died. The most traveled human being we know of. So here's the route of Ibn Battuta's travels. You can see how widely he traveled. It's just incredible. Okay, one of the places that Ibn Battuta spent the most time, the longest time, one was in Delhi. The second one was in, anyone want to guess? Can I get a guess? Maldives. Did you already know that, or you just like the Maldives? So he knew a good resort town when he saw one. He said he worked as a Sharia court judge in the Maldives for several years, actually. Okay, as a judge in the Maldives in the mid-1300s, this is in his own words, he, quote, strove with all my might to establish the rule of law, to get rid of, quote, bad customs, like requiring divorced women to stay in the house of their former husbands until she married again. So apparently, according to him, one of the local customs is if a woman got divorced, she would stay in her former husband's house until she remarried. He was trying to stop that. The second one is he wanted women to start covering their breasts. Apparently, they did not cover their breasts. So they would just wear a sarong, like lungi. And the most he could do was get them to put tops on when they came in the courts. But they would not listen to him otherwise. So you can see, he's just like, people, this is completely against the Sharia. You guys are Muslims. You can't walk around topless. Then I was doing this talk, and I said to myself, wait a second. Do women still walk around topless in the Maldives? Like, has this actually changed? I've never heard of this, but I've never been to the Maldives. And boy, am I going to seem stupid if I go into giving this talk and someone says, yeah, that still happens. So I Googled, do women go topless in the Maldives? And of course, I forgot that the Maldives is like a tourist destination. So it said, the tourism ministry says it is absolutely prohibited for women to do topless sunbathing. So I guess that culture has changed, you can see. But then this is really interesting. I found this. This is actually a 16th century Portuguese drawing, anonymous Portuguese painting of the inhabitants of the Maldives. So this is about 250 years, 150 years after, 150, 200 years after Ibn Batuta. Looky here. This guy's not doing it. His aura is not covered either. And she's definitely not. So anyway, it was interesting to try and find some kind of corroboration for this. So I found this, the wonders of Google. All right. So he could not get people to change. He couldn't get women to wear tops. It's like being at a hotel pool in France. Sorry, I figure I'm in Britain. I need to get some kind of dig at the French. If that's okay. All right. The second example, here I don't have any pictures, unfortunately. The second example is Berber alwah. These are fascinating. The earliest lawh means board, like lawh al-mahfuz. Alwah is the plural. So these are these boards that apparently were agreements between Berber tribes that were Muslim, but were not so interested in a lot of the details of the Sharia. And so basically Muslim scholars who were trying to instruct them would kind of come up with these agreements. They were like kind of compromise agreements about what rules are we going to follow, how are we going to deal with certain issues. And the oldest one we know of is from 1498 from Agadir in what's now, I think, Morocco is where that is. Who can tell me where that is? Okay, good. For example, there's some not so dramatic cases. For example, in the Souss Valley of Morocco, one of the alwah says that instead of needing 2 witnesses to notarize a document, you just need 1 witness to notarize a document. So what would happen is the ulama dealing with these alwah, they would go outside the Maliki school of law and they would take okay, we're going to take a Hanafi ruling here, we're going to take a Shafi ruling here to really try and just find the best way to kind of tailor, make the Sharia as flexible as possible for you. And as long as the ruling doesn't go outside the outer bounds of the Sharia, we will basically come to some kind of compromise, so you're still following the Sharia. More dramatic example, the Masmuda Berbers, they had a tradition which was if someone was an alcoholic, they would get their house burned down. So if you drank a lot of alcohol, your house got burned down. This is not acceptable this is not a known opinion in the Sharia, let's put it that way, okay? But they really kind of went back to some hadiths about allegedly someone burnt someone's share of the spoils of war. And one point, the Prophet said, made an allusion to the imagery of burning someone's house down if they did something wrong, although he never did it and never commanded it done. But it's like kind of just the image of that. And they said, okay, we're going to accept this. So if you were a multi-time drinker, basically an alcoholic, you got your house burned down. Okay, why compromise? Why this kind of compromise? As Al-Wazani, a famous Moroccan scholar who died in 1923, notes, the Beni Muhi from the Beit Yasun tribe, a Berber tribe, they actually held a funeral for the Sharia. They got a bunch of fiqh books and they dug a grave and they put them in the grave and they covered it up with dirt and they said, this is the Sharia, we're burying the Sharia. We want nothing to do with it, right? So they realized that they didn't want to push these people to the point where they rejected Islam. And they could do so in very dramatic ways. Third example. So the first example was the Iban Batuta and the topless women. The second example, the Berber Alwa. The third example, staying in Northwest Africa, in Morocco, and what's today kind of Morocco, Mauritania area. We're going to look at the question of juris and the question of race and marriage. Now, one jurist is discussing this issue about whether or not someone, a man in this case, right? A man being from one of his patrilineal ancestors was a slave. So someone, his father, his grandfather. And also the person may be, we don't know exactly, but the person may be like phenotypically black, very dark skinned. And what happened was he was actually a really powerful guy. He was a chief. And he had, he proposed marriage to the daughter of a very well-known, like a family from a very good lineage, like descendants of the Prophet. And the family agreed. He had a big celebration. And then people insulted and kind of teased this woman's family for years and years and years, that they had married their daughter to like a descendant of a slave, a black slave, right? So here's the question. Is being of slave descent or being phenotypically black, is that considered a defect in marriage? Is that considered like something that makes somebody inappropriate as a marriage partner? Now, the position of Malik, the actual founder of the Maliki school, right, was that it means nothing. Muslims, the Maliki school is the most egalitarian of all the schools of law when it comes to issues of kafa'ah or marriage suitability. All the Muslims are the same. But, so Malik said, he specifically said, blackness is not an aib. This is not like a defect in marriage. It's not a reason to see someone as not you're suitable for you in marriage. But by the time of like the 1500s and 1600s, especially in North Africa, it had become the main position in the Maliki school that, in fact, it was valid grounds for discrimination in marriage. Why? Because the Sharia commands Muslims to respect custom. As long as it doesn't violate the Sharia. And what they said is, I mean, this doesn't technically violate Sharia. We'll discuss this later. I know it's a controversial issue. But for them, for the majority of Maliki scholars in North Africa, this did not violate the Sharia, and so they accepted this. But why? When people came up to them and said, for example, what about Malik's opinion? What about all the hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ says people that, Arabs and non-Arabs are equal, and that black people and white people, black people and red people, basically what today would be white people, are the same, except in they're only distinguished from one another in terms of their piety and their deeds. And what one great scholar from the 1600s says is, if you think this, go marry your daughter to the descendant of a slave. And the guy's, okay. And this is very interesting. And I want to be clear, just so none of you come away from this talk with a bad impression. In Islamic civilization in general, and this is a very accurate generalization. It's a generalization, but it's a very accurate one. Slave descent doesn't mean anything, right? So let's say you have, if your mother is a slave, it doesn't mean anything at all. And if your father or your patrilineal ancestors were slaves, it also doesn't have any meaning. Once you become a free person, you basically just enter into Muslim society like everybody else. And many of the early Muslim scholars, great Muslim scholars, Makhul al-Shami, Ibn Ishaq, Nafi', Muhammad ibn Sirin, the list goes on and on, are either themselves freed slaves, or their fathers were freed slaves, or their grandfathers were freed slaves. The second thing that's true in general in Islamic civilization is that slavery is not racialized by phenotype, right? So you wouldn't know someone's a slave from the way they look. One of the main reasons for this is a lot of people's mothers were slaves. So most of the Abbasid caliphs, their mothers were slave women. Almost all of the Ottoman sultans, their mothers were slave women. Unlike, let's say, slavery in the United States and other places in Western Europe, if your mother's a slave, and let's say your mother is a slave of your father, and they have children, you are born free, You're the same standing as a freeborn child. And you're totally legitimate, and you're part of. It's as if you were born from your father's wife, right? So there's absolutely no social stigma attached to being the son of a concubine. The weird thing about Northwest Africa is it doesn't follow this rule. I have not found anyone who can explain this to me except to tell me Mauritania is a weird place. That's all. They say Mauritania is a weird place. It's not just Mauritania. It's just Mauritania and Morocco, and kind of into, of course, the border between these things is colonial, kind of into Algeria. These places are very unusual in Islamic history. One, they really care about descent from slaves. If you're a descendant from, patrilineally descended from a slave, it's like, it's a social stigma. Two, dark skin was associated with that. Again, if you went to the street in Cairo in, let's say, 1500, and you saw someone with really dark skin, they could be a slave. They could be someone who's the son of the governor of the city, and their mother is a African slave woman. Just as an example for this, even in Morocco, the great Sultan Maula Ismail, who died in 1727, he's like considered the founder of modern Morocco. His mother was African. So when Europeans talked about it, Europeans were so scared of him because he was such a powerful ruler. And they described this. We were really confused because this guy looked like African to us. Similar, Ibn Tushfin, the founder of the AlMaravid State, another great Moroccan, North African, and Andalusian dynasty. You can see some of their buildings have still survived in places like Marrakesh, the Almoravids, al-Murabitun. They were founded by a guy named Yusuf ibn Tushfin, whose mother also was an African slave woman, and he was also very, very dark-skinned. So it's not, if your father's side is really prestigious, it doesn't really affect you. But that descent, if your father's side is descended from slaves, in Northwest Africa, this is a huge stigma. And again, this is very unusual in Islamic civilization. By the way, I also want to say that there's a lot of scholars in the Maliki school who continued with Malik's original opinion. People like Al-Qurtubi, you guys have read his tafsir. People like the Al-Qadi Abu Bakr al-Arabi, who died about 1146. Al-Qurtubi died 1272. And others stuck with Malik's original opinion. They said, Al-Muslimun, the hadith says, Al-Muslimun وَتَتَكَافَأَ دِمَاؤُهُم, right? Muslims, their blood is the same. Their blood is equal. But you can see, remember that story of the chief, the chief who marries into this good family. If you're a Muslim scholar and you're giving people advice, you're trying to act as a steward, if you will. What do you tell somebody? Yes, Muslims are equal. But if the wife's family is going to get mocked for years and years, can you advise the marriage go ahead? Should you? Right? That's a really interesting question. What is your duty as a steward? The last vignette I want to talk about is the case of caste in Hanafi law in South Asia. I'll discuss this a little bit more at the end. I just want you to trust me for a second. People have lots of debate. People say, what do you mean there's no caste in Islam? How can you say this? These are political debates. This is a political issue. This is really, like, for example, Muslims will say we don't have castes in distinction to Hindus. This goes back, by the way, all the way to Ibn al-Biruni, 1048, the famous Central Asian Muslim polymath, scholar, scientist, historian, in his amazing Tahqiq Ma fil Hind, description of India. Has anyone read it? Anyone here from South Asian background? A few people. You should read this book. It's been translated in English. So one of the things he says, one of the main differences between Islam and the religions in India is they have this system of caste where your birth determines who you can marry, and these groups don't intermarry, and it's based on your profession and your function in life. And there's also the rules of ritual purity around, eating with people of different castes and things like that. And he says, in Islam we don't have this, and this is one of the major obstacles between our tradition and their tradition. But culture is an aircraft carrier, And when Muslims go into settle in India, two things happen. One, the Muslims who settle there, coming from Central Asia and also from the Arabian Gulf area, like into the kind of Malabar coast, they start to get influenced by local traditions. That's one way. The second way is Muslims who are people who are converting to Islam in South Asia bring with them caste sensibilities. In fact, sometimes whole castes will just convert to Islam as a caste. So you have basically arising next to the Hindu, kind of what we'll call Hindu caste structure. You have something amongst Muslims, and there's a lot of debate amongst sociologists, Muslim sociologists included. Is this, can we call it caste? Is it, different than caste? What the general opinion I'd say is that it's not as strict as caste is in Hinduism, where you have these like very strict notions of, not eating with other people and not touching them and not letting them come into mosques. But it's very clear that the hierarchy the sense of hierarchy in Muslim society in South Asia is much, much more intense than it is in any other part of the Muslim world. And that this is, there's clear kind of parallelisms and also, let's say, seepage, acculturation with the majority Hindu traditions. It's a very political issue because, Muslims still to this day, right, will show themselves as our religion is superior to Hinduism. One of the reasons is we don't have caste. And then, by the way, you'll see, let's say, some kind of hardcore Hindu nationalist will also agree with them. Why? Because if you're a minority caste in India, you can get essentially preferential treatment. You get affirmative action. You become a scheduled caste. And they don't want Muslims. Muslims are in India, a lot of them are extremely poor, kind of underprivileged groups. So this is actually a group of part of the population that would be ideal candidate to be a scheduled caste. But how does sort of Hindu nationalists get around admitting Muslims into this group? Is they say Muslims don't have caste. So you have a weird situation where kind of Muslim nationalists and Hindu nationalists are both agreeing that Muslims don't have caste. But in reality, as I said, you see features about concerns about intermarriage and class in Islam in South Asia that you do not see, or with much greater intensity than you see anywhere else in the Islamic world. Okay. But I'll just, the story the vignette I want to tell you is this scholar named Sheikh Yunus al-Jaunpuri. He was one of the scholars, I think, in Mazahir al-Ulum in North India. He died in 2017, just a few years ago. And he says in some of his writings, he says, I don't advise marriage between castes. And even what he means, I don't even advise marriage between someone from like Saharanpur and Jaunpur, like even cities that are relatively close to one another. He says, I've seen these quote unquote love marriages, they don't work out. There's too much tension, it's not worth it. It's very interesting. So on the one hand, you could say there's no caste in Islam. The most important, like the Prophet says, if someone comes to you and you approve of their religion and their character, then marry your daughter to them, or else there'll be great fitna in the land. There'll be great strife in the land. So we know that piety, like the Quran says, in akramakum indallahi atqakum, the most noble in God's eyes is the most pious amongst you. So Muslim scholars know this. So piety is obviously very important. But Yunus al-Jaunpuri, rahimahullah, here is saying, yeah, but still, practically speaking, if you cross some of these boundaries, it's going to be practically very difficult for you to manage your relationship.